Hi, welcome back to Donna's Quilt Studios tutorials. Today I'm going to show you our way that we put on our continuous binding around the edge of a quilt. This is a simple technique and I'm sure once you follow the simple steps you'll find it very effective. Now the first thing you want to do is we're going to cut our strips for our binding. Now I always cut them from selvage to selvage, so you get a little bit of a give in your fabric, but not a lot. We're going to cut it at 2.5 inches wide, and obviously you're going to need enough strips to get right around the edge of your quilt and a little bit extra for seams. Right, so here I have our quilt ready to go, edges all trimmed back, and our strips. Now I'm going to show you how to join these strips together using a bias seam. It sounds scary, but I'll show you a really simple little technique. You take your strips and we're going to get the ends together and just pop them at a 90-degree like that, like so. You can see that I've already ironed in a diagonal crease. That's the seam that we're going to sew on. To get that diagonal crease, all you have to do is you'd have to take your corner over, line the edges up, give them a press, and then open them up. Now I'm going to make sure that that corner's lined up on the edge there, and this corner, underneath, this corner is lined up with the edge of the line there. And we're just going to stitch right along the line. There we have it, our seam already sewn. Now before we go to the next step, just check that you've sewn along the right diagonal. So open it up and it should be a continuous line. Right, now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to just trim that back, approximately 1/4 inch, doesn't have to be perfect. And now we're going to open it up and we're going to press that seam open. Now the reason why we do it on the diagonal and we press the seam open is that when it goes into your binding, the seam is dispersed evenly. If we did a straight seam, it would all be in one area and would cause quite a big lump. Right, so now we're going to press that open with the iron. So this is the wrong side. And then press all your seams that you've joined together. You're going to join them together in one big long strip. Once we've got our strip all sewn together, we're now going to take our 2.5 inch strip and we're going to fold it in half with the wrong side in the middle. So it's right side's facing up, and we're just going to carefully iron it in half all the way along the whole strip. Now we're going to take our binding strip and find the center of one of the edges of your quilt. It doesn't really matter where you're starting, and it doesn't have to be exactly in the center, but somewhere near the middle. We're going to line up the center of the quilt about 10 inches from the edge of that piece of binding and pin it in place. Now we want everything to be sitting nice and flat, so take your quilt, lay it nice and flat, and lay your binding with the raw edges of your binding lined up to the raw edges of your quilt. Just make sure that everything's just laying nice and flat, and pin it in place up to the edge of the side there. Now I use about a 3/8 of an inch seam to sew this in place. So it's just a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. I feel it fills the binding once it's finished a lot nicer. We're going to start sewing here, so 10 inches from the end of your binding. I'm going to start sewing here, and we're going to sew with our 3/4 of an inch seam, not right to the end. Now I'll show you this little tip. To sew to 3/8 of an inch from the edge, we really need a little point of marker. The easiest way to do it is we're going to take our binding strip, we're going to fold it so the fold goes right into the corner there, and this edge of your binding is in line with this edge here. That will ensure that that's a 45-degree angle line, so you can crease it with your finger and open it up. If you're still having problem seeing that, you can just make it, I've just chalked it in there so that you can see. Now, so we're going to sew to the chalk line. Now you can see that I've got my walking foot on here. This just makes it a little bit easier to sew through all the thicknesses. Try not to sew over your pins, but it's not the best for your needle. And now we're just going to sew along to the chalk line. There. Now I'm going to show you how to do the mitered corner. Always sounds scary, but honestly it's really simple. This initial chalk line or fold line that we've sewn to, that's going to be our first fold again. So we're going to take that up at a 45-degree angle so that the fold is right in the corner. Now you do have to be really accurate with this. Finger press it down, and then we're going to fold it back, and we're now going to fold it so the fold is in line with the edge of your quilt here. I'm going to fold it down so that just becomes a straight edge right on the edge. That's in line there, and now we're in line here. Now I'm just going to put a couple of pins in there to hold it. Now we're up to our next corner, so again, remember the fold is straight up at a 45-degree angle line, finger press down, then straight down with that folded edge now on top of that edge there, and pop a little pin in it. Now I've done all the sides, and the last piece that I've done is the end of the side that we started. Now what I've done is I've left a gap, probably about a 10-inch gap will work best, and now we have to join it up. Now because we joined our binding strips on the bias, we want to do the same with this, and this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, but once you've shown how, it all makes sense. We're going to take the first piece and we're going to lay it down so that it's nice and flat as if it was going to be sewn down. And we trim it off about an inch or so past the midway point of your space. So just make that a straight cut. Then we're going to take our other end, and we're also going to just lay that down. Now what we want to do is we want to cut this so that the overlap of the two pieces of binding is the width of the binding when we cut it. So my one was 2.5 inches, so we're going to overlap this by 2.5 inches. Now here's a really useful little tip. This is the little piece that we've cut off, so I'm going to open it up. That's 2.5 inches along there. I place that on the edge that we've already cut, place this on top, so everything's all sitting nice and flat, and then I carefully pick this up with this little bit, and the edge of there is where we're going to cut it. Okay, so that's a 2.5 inch overlap. Now to join these together, we're going to take our bindings, open them up, so we've got right sides together, and we're just going to place them on that 90-degree corner like so, and we're going to stitch through the diagonal. So you may want to mark that diagonal on. Now the easiest way to mark this diagonal line is by taking one corner and taking it over to the edge. and we can just finger press that in place to get our diagonal line that we're going to sew on. Right, so we're going to take that in place. I always make sure I pin on the diagonal crease. And just before we start to sew, make sure that you've got it in the correct position by just opening it up and laying it down. Now, it's quite easy to put a little twist in here, so just double check. Mine's okay, and now I'm just going to take it and I'm just going to sew through that diagonal seam. There, I've sewn that seam along through that diagonal line. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to trim the seam allowance back, press it open, and then press it in place. So I'm just going to take that over to the iron. Right, so we're just going to iron that seam nice and flat, and then re-iron the binding in place, just carefully, making sure it's nice and flat and even along the edge. And now we're just going to continue sewing. I just overlap it a little bit all the way down to there. Now we've completed the first step of sewing the binding on. We've done all the machine stitching. Now we're going to have to stitch the rest down by hand. All we're going to do is we're going to take the binding and we're going to fold it over to the back, and I hand stitch it just so that we can cover up that row of stitching that we've sewn on. We're going to hand stitch along. Now when we come to do the corners, they automatically just fold into place. So we take that down like that and then fold over the other edge, and that will be our completed binding there. I hope you'll find this a very useful tutorial. I know it's a great way to do a binding, and it's the way that I always do all my bindings. Nice and simple, always looks good and sits really flat. So good luck with finishing off your quilts, and until next time, we'll see you then.